welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. President Joe Biden was reportedly visibly shaking as he got off Air Force One 2 weeks ago and was unable to get into an SUV on his own. This was a report not by a MAGA-inspired X account, but by the Daily Mail's Emily Goodin, the week after Biden spoke at the Democratic National Convention. Quote, walking slowly down the plane stairs, he struggled to step into the SUV waiting to take him to the 8,000-acre Santa Barbara ranch where he and his family had just been enjoying a week-long vacation, she wrote. One of his Secret Service agents moved to shield him from the watching cameras before giving him a helpful boost into the car, end quote. Biden's worsening condition, which plagued his July debate against Donald Trump and at least one speech given during the NATO anniversary that month, in which he mixed up the names of Putin and Zelensksy and his Vice President Harris and Donald Trump, led to his replacement as Democratic nominee for a second presidential term. After endorsing Kamala to take his place, Biden has all but slipped from view. In that same tweet, Goodin noted that his public schedule had been all but wiped clean that week. Sure, there are politics at play and vacations. It was the end of the summer. But let's get down to brass tacks. There are two major, very bloody and brutal land wars being fueled by U.S. weapons and assistance today, one in Ukraine and the other Israel. There seems to be wide acceptance that Biden was not fit to run again for president, but little discussion about how he is running the country through these fraught foreign policy situations. Who is running the foreign policy if not him? Does it matter? Or have we just put too much emphasis on the commander-in-chief that we have forgotten that this is a republic with balancing branches of government to prevent disaster if one is not able to perform at 100%? Here to discuss this issue is conservative Dan McCarthy, editor of Modern Age, and to show that we are not making this a red-blue issue, James Cardin, who writes for both The Nation and The American Conservative. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly.
Great to see you both. So I'm going to ask you the first question, James. Should we be concerned about Biden's health and cognitive abilities? I mean, he is president until January, and it's only the beginning of September, and there's a lot going on in the world right now.
Should we be concerned? No, because he's been the same person for most of his term. Some of this isn't really new. You've had reports on both the left and the right throughout his presidency noting his cognitive decline. So, for instance, in January of 2022, the New York Post had a headline, "The man in charge at the White House isn't Joe Biden." And then at the leftward-leaning Nation, they had an article that asked, who's in charge in the Biden White House? And that came 3 months before the career-ending debate with Trump. So this is a question that has kind of plagued the Biden White House from its earliest days. And the question of who is actually running the show, there are a number of theories. I reported on one such theory for a piece in the Asia Times a couple of years back that posited that there was a kind of Reagan-like style troika consisting of Ron Klain, Bruce Reed, and Mike Donlin. Other people believe that Jake Sullivan is the real power behind the throne. Franklin Foer, in a new book, reported that Sullivan is not only the power behind the throne with regard to foreign policy, he actually has a real hand in the formation of domestic policy as well. So, no, I think that, Biden is what he is, and things are going to continue the way they were.
How do you respond to that, Dan? Should we be concerned, or as James is pointing out, there's always been some sort of machinery in the background of every president that's actually running the gears of the administration, and this is no different, except for the guy at the titular top there is just there's a lot of question about whether he is fully engaged or not.
Well, I would say that the two premises of the question are not really in conflict. So we should be concerned, but we should be concerned for the reasons that James says, which go beyond the personal capacity of Joe Biden and instead speak to who's actually making Democratic Party policy from administration to administration. One of the things I think is very notable right now is that there doesn't seem to be any push to get Joe Biden to leave office and make way for Kamala Harris before January, which is surprising because you would think, well, there would seem to be a partisan advantage here if Kamala Harris were to become president before the election. There's also, simply the embarrassment that Americans suffer when they see that Joe Biden is someone who is physically and mentally not up to the task of being president. And yet the party certainly does not see this as being an imperative substitution to make. And Kamala Harris's own remarks suggest that, she is not running as any kind of alternative to or change from what Biden has been delivering, even in the condition that he's in. So James is right. What's going to happen here is that there will be a continuity in terms of policy from one Democratic administration to the next. And it's the personnel may change a little bit. The nominal person in charge, as the commander in chief, may change, but fundamentally the same sort of misguided policies are going to continue. There is an issue here where both Biden and Harris are probably not going to have much respect on the public stage. Now, in the American media, it's very easy for these discussions of respect to become just completely detached from reality, and to think of this in terms of, well, if the rest of the world doesn't like Donald Trump, then that's going to make America weak. But actually, the rest of the world, it's not a matter of like or dislike. It's a matter of, you look at Joe Biden and you say, if this person has to make a decision in a crisis situation, is he going to be capable of doing it? If not, then somebody else in the administration is going to do it. And that person may or may not have the support of the American public. You have a country that is involved in these two very extensive conflicts that you mentioned, Kelly, that doesn't seem to have any kind of vector for the public providing legitimacy for these conflicts. So you're right that, not only is the executive branch, with its nominal head, the commander in chief, not really not being run the way the Constitution says it should be run. Clearly, you're not having Congress step in here either. So there is some sort of unelected power that is actually guiding this administration and its foreign policy. And Kamala Harris seems to be prepared to have the same force be guiding her foreign policy should she win in November.
Interesting. So, James, if we take your theory just a step further, that there is a team of people who have been working behind the scenes all this time, really, engaged in our foreign policy, is there a valid complaint that we didn't elect those people? We don't necessarily know who they are, except for when James Corden reports or other reporters kind of dig in the weeds and sort of glean this information. But on the most part, the American people don't really even know who Jake Sullivan is unless they're really paying attention to foreign policy and national security news. Is there an undemocratic aspect of this where people are running our foreign policy, which, as we acknowledge, is really vital right now because of ongoing conflicts and our stamp on them overseas? And nobody voted for these people or had a proper vetting of their ability or inability to run national security and foreign policy.
Yes, but it's always been that way. So the American people probably don't pay much attention to foreign policy. I very seriously doubt if they even know the names of the people who've been confirmed by the Senate. So there's no reason to believe that they know the names of the people that we deal with in our jobs. I mean, there is kind of a precedent that was set, not a good one, but during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, it's widely been reported that Nixon was out of commission due perhaps to drink and stress over Watergate, and Henry Kissinger, who was the national security advisor, unilaterally made the decision to put American nuclear forces to DEFCON 3. So, that's kind of the way that the foreign policy system works. I'm not defending it, but that is the way that it is. So I think in terms of the Biden administration, I think actually the last time we had a president who was actually probably involved deeply in the minutia of foreign policy decisions was probably during the Obama term. And we saw how that turned out, kind of a mixed bag.
Is there any difference now, Dan, given the security situations overseas, the amount of money and weapons that are being transferred to Ukraine and Israel, the tense situation with China over Taiwan? Is it more important than ever that at least world leaders, the American people, allies, partners, whatever you want to call them, at least see that there is some head, that there is somebody representing the United States in that commander-in-chief role, rather than just assuming that things are happening behind the scenes and just having faith that that they'll be capable of doing that effectively?
Yeah, it certainly isn't anything new that responsibility within the executive branch has been diffused, and the buck does not always, in fact, stop where you would expect it to. That said, we have both of these conflicts which have a high potential for escalation, and if we don't know who the decision makers actually are, if there is, a risk that somebody who is not the president is going to be making decisions that then commit our country to wider conflicts and to more difficult situations than we're already in, that's going to be something which will have, you'd think that voters would need to have some knowledge of that beforehand. They need to know that, what are you going to get if you buy this package? And James is right. Most voters are not very well informed about this. It's not something they're paying close attention to. But I think the risks right now are higher than they typically are because, again, you have any number of, underlings within the executive branch could make a decision that then winds up having drastic implications for all of us. And, we've certainly seen enough examples in the past 20 years, whether it was George W. Bush, who was, quite capable of getting into wars that he couldn't get out of by himself, but who, egged on by Dick Cheney, egged on by, people throughout his administration, whom he deferred to and whom he thought of as being experts and authorities, all of that led to a situation that was even worse than George W. Bush's own instincts would have led us into. Similarly, in the Trump administration, you certainly had a number of people who were actually working against Donald Trump's own stated aims in foreign policy, in terms of people who wanted us to get deeper into Syria, for example, who wanted to, maintain and expand U.S. involvement in the Middle East. So it's a problem with every administration, and it seems to be an exceptionally big problem with the Biden administration. And all the signals are that Harris wants to continue in the same direction that Biden has gone down.
And I'm just going to stay on this thread and then we can move on. But two things. One, we're all of a certain age here. We've been through multiple administrations in our adult, voting lives. Have you ever seen a president like this who appears to be not 100% firing on all cylinders? And I include Reagan in that because everybody's under the assumption that Reagan was suffering from Alzheimer's in his last term. I don't think there's ever, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that there has been any evidence that was the case, although he was the oldest president at that time in office, and he later did come out in the late 90s or mid 90s and say, I have Alzheimer's, and and this is, he publicly acknowledges. But to this level, to this extent, have you seen a president who clearly seems out of it on the job and has several more months in office left? James?
No, not even close. And I mean, even if Reagan was suffering from early onset dementia during his last term, he did manage to sort of pull off one of the greatest diplomatic feats of all time with his work with Premier Gorbachev. So no, I mean, Reagan could still deliver a speech. I mean, he appeared before the RNC in 1992 to give George H.W. a boost. I would say, if you compare Reagan's performance then to anything that you've seen Biden do over the past couple of years, there's no comparison, and the comparison does not favor Joe Biden.
Dan?
Yeah, I would agree. Even the most pessimistic assessment of Ronald Reagan's condition in the late 1980s nonetheless would have to acknowledge that he was still on the job, not just 9 to 5, but keeping the kinds of hours you would expect a president to keep. And he was, as James mentions, still capable of giving a very cogent address to the Republican National Convention in 1992. He was someone who certainly the public did not lose confidence in Reagan, fearing that he had Alzheimer's at that point in the 1980s. Joe Biden, on the other hand, the absenteeism has been, I think, unprecedented, that he really does seem to be someone who can't even be seen in public in many cases, and who, when he's called upon, even at NATO's anniversary, bash, where the whole point is to, have a great public relations, celebration, and try to gin up as much, enthusiasm as possible with the public and with the policymaking elites for NATO. Even there, Joe Biden is still stumbling over his words. He is mixing and matching Zelensksy and Putin and Trump and Harris. If that's what Biden does, in one of the most important public functions that he would see himself as having, at this point in his administration, just imagine what things look like behind the scenes. Just imagine what would look like
Right.
if Biden had to go out and have more casual interactions with the public. So I think, yeah, this is unprecedented. And it again sends the signals. We like to think of ourselves as being a proud democracy, that we're so different from all these countries that are run by these shadowy elites that are completely undemocratic, like China. And yet, if you are a foreign potentate of some kind and you're looking at the United States, how are you assessing this country? You're saying, well, look, this is not about the American people deciding we're going to elect this person and his policy is going to be what we follow. Instead, this is a system where there is a permanent, more or less permanent, or certainly permanently attached to each of the parties, there is a elite, a policy-making cadre, which is the thing that we have to be concerned about. Just as a lot of American analysts say, well, we have to be concerned not just with Xi Jinping, but also with the Communist Party as a whole in China. Well, in America, clearly the president's even less important. It's actually, the question of who is actually running, staffing an Obama administration, a Harris administration, a Biden administration, or conversely, a Bush or a Trump administration. These questions are of the utmost importance for anyone trying to predict what America is going to do in the world. And right now, the other problem, too, is that while this is clear enough on paper, in practice, because it's not certain who these individuals are, and because it's not certain how much the relationship between the president and the public is going to be sustainable, it's very possible that some underling who doesn't really have the confidence even of the president, let alone the public, is going to be in a position to make decisions that could be very fateful and fatal for Americans and for other people around the world. And what kind of control or restraint or checks and balances will there be applying to that person? With Biden, it's become worse than ever, even though, as James says, this is something that is clearly a long-term problem for American government.
Let me ask, why aren't Republicans making more hay out of this? I mean, they're demanding, they've subpoenaed Blinken over the Afghanistan withdrawal. There was a series of, rightfully so, of hearings on the attempted assassination of Trump. There have been, Republicans have the House. They could start mixing it up over this issue. Why haven't they demanded to hear more about Biden's health? Why are they not pointing out, other than on social media and podcasts and conservative talk radio, that the Democrats have replaced Biden because he was not fit to run for president, but somehow we have to agree or somehow not question whether or not he's fit to run the country and continue on in the Oval Office? Is there a reason why they're not pressing this issue? What am I missing in terms of the political gain, or maybe not gain on doing that?
Well, I'm not really sure. I mean, this is sort of a unique situation because right now we have a president who is functionally brain dead, who is likely to be replaced by his vice president, who is also fairly brain dead. So I don't know.
That's your opinion on
What
both counts.
I don't know what
That
role
is the host.
Congress would play in pushing the cabinet to invoke, say, the 25th Amendment.
And then have her president.
Right.
And then she would be in a better position in November for
Exactly.
continuum.
Which raises it, like Dan mentioned this earlier. I mean, it's interesting that, why haven't the Democrats gone all the way and pushed him out? I think that would benefit.
That is a good question.
Candidacy an enormous amount if she was an incumbent, even if for 60 days or whatever we have left.
What do you think, Dan?
Well, I agree. This is something I've been, trying to figure out for some time. My best guess is that just as we've seen, Kamala Harris has made every superhuman effort she possibly can to avoid having press conferences and to avoid, having, spontaneous interactions with anyone, even with members of the press who may be very favorable towards her, let alone, an unscripted encounter with the public or with other, figures who might show that her strengths or deficiencies, as a functioning would-be president. If Joe Biden were to resign and Harris were to become president automatically, all of these, deficiencies of Kamala Harris would suddenly be acutely under the spotlight. So I think there really is a sense here that the Democrats want her to run as a blank slate, as someone who, cannot be closely identified, to the extent that a vice president who's been, more or less anonymous. We talked earlier about, do Americans know who Jake Sullivan is? I think a lot of Americans didn't know who Kamala Harris was. And now, she's the nominee. I think the Democrats want to have a stealth campaign here rather than having someone who is as high profile as a new president would be. Kamala were to become, Biden's replacement immediately. And that would, again, expose her weaknesses. She would then be directly responsible for all of these foreign policy conflicts, should be directly responsible for domestic policy. People would say, just as she has been asked once or twice, even by friendly media, you say that you want to do X, Y, and Z, but you've obviously been part of an administration for 4 years now. Why hasn't this administration already done the things that you're pledging to do? Well, if she were actually president, that question would become all the more acute, and all the more embarrassing. So as awful as it is, this is kind of a sign that the Democrats from, Biden, they are committed to exactly the model that James mentions. They want to be, just have a figurehead who's a kind of feel-good figure, and then have the actual substance of policy being something that's concocted by, God knows who, leading the country God knows where. I mean, there's this famous, quote from Nancy Pelosi that conservatives love to bring up, that Republicans love to bring up, where Pelosi says, this is actually about Obamacare, I believe, that, hey, if you want to know what's in the bill, you've got to pass it first. Well, it's the same way with the presidential administrations. If you want to know what you're going to get from Kamala Harris, you've got to elect her first. And of course, those of us who know what kind of continuity to expect between Biden and Harris, we already have the answer to that, but the American public doesn't, and they're being bamboozled here. Yeah,
that's right. And, just to point out the obvious, Harris is not in town. She is not working in her capacity as vice president. She is in full campaign mode. And so when she goes out there and she talks about meeting with leaders and being at the table at negotiations and supporting Ukraine and leading a coalition of countries against the Russian invasion, like she did during her DNC speech, that's all in the past. She is not in that capacity now. So both her and Biden are pretty much MIA on these very important issues. I guess the next question is, okay, so I'm going to put you both on the spot here. In terms of, if we're looking at who is behind the man, who is behind the woman in each of these campaigns, if each were to win president, what kind of confidence do you have that the right people will be in position? And I'm kind of feeling where you might be on that, but let's start with Harris. Do we have any sense of what her foreign policy shop might look like? whether she might retain some of these Obama people or whether they're already, getting their resumes ready for the next stage in their lives. What can we expect? I mean, let's talk. This is the question. James?
So I think a clue to that can be found in one of James Mann's books. So James Mann famously wrote a book about the George W. Bush administration called The Vulcans. And then he wrote one about the Obama administration. And in that book, he talks about this so-called Aspen group. And there are a bunch of people who came up, foreign policy types who came up through the Clinton administration and then got together very early on, decided to back the young senator from Illinois, Obama, and went subsequently on to work in his administration. One of those is a person by the name of Philip Goodin, and Goodin is Kamala Harris's national security advisor. So it's widely expected that he's going to come aboard the Harris administration as national security advisor and probably bring some of his friends from that group into the administration. So we're going to see some Obama retreads in the same way we saw a lot of Obama retreads during the Biden administration. There's not going to be a lot new there.
But we don't know too much about Phil either. I've been reading every piece of news and op-ed and research or whatever reference to him in the last month. And all I can get is that he said some mildly skeptical things about U.S. policy in the Middle East. That if there's more out there, please let me know. But I feel like he's just as much of a blank slate. And because he's part of this cadre of establishmentarians who, like you mentioned, came up through the ranks of the Aspen group and Democratic administration, I don't really, there's not a lot to hang my hat on there in terms of how he would be different than, say, Blinken or Sullivan, because we had the same conversations about them when they first came into office with Biden, was that, they say mildly different things about U.S. policy in the world and diplomacy and whatnot. And there was all sorts of optimism that they would be different than, say, whoever was on the Obama team and the Clinton team before that. So I don't know, Dan, have you been paying attention to any of the sort of tea leaf reading?
I haven't, but in part, I haven't been paying close attention because I take it for granted that the Democratic Party has not had the kind of foreign policy reckoning which has taken place, at least to some degree, within the Republican Party. So, there are a lot of Republican neocons or former Republican neocons who are absolutely, astonished and appalled and, are constantly taking to Twitter and to the pages of the New York Times to denounce Donald Trump. And really what they're worried about isn't so much Donald Trump himself, but it's a lot of Trump supporters, because clearly there are a lot of Trump supporters who really do want a very different kind of U.S. foreign policy. And this conversation has been going on in the Republican Party. You can look back, a decade and more to the Ron Paul movement, for example, or for that matter, even to the 1990s with, Pat Buchanan was largely tossed aside by the party, but clearly he represented a very different view of America's role in the world relative to the Bushes and the Republican Party establishment. The Democrats, on the other hand, have really, I think, stuck with the same general approach to foreign policy since Bill Clinton, and maybe even a little bit before that. And this is a approach to foreign policy which says you can kind of have it both ways. The Democrats think of themselves as still being a party of less aggressive foreign policy, but they also want to be a party of humanitarian intervention and a party that can't be tagged as, sort of anti-war hippies, McGovernites and so forth.
Right.
So Bill Clinton, who had himself dodged the Vietnam draft, he was nonetheless a very hawkish president, in fact. But he would not, necessarily present himself that way. He would say, well, this is all kind of international social work, that we're bombing Serbia, that we're continuing to bomb Iraq. This is just police work. This is social work. This is not actually war. Obama had much of the same policies, but they were a little bit tempered by the fact that America had just gone insane during the war on terror with George W. Bush. So by comparison, Obama was able to look like a peace president almost because he wasn't George W. Bush. And of course, the Nobel Committee gives him the Nobel Peace Prize the minute he gets into office, which is just humiliating for them.
For just existing.
That's
for just
exactly
winning.
right. Simply for not being George W. Bush,
Right.
and for being the idea of hope and change, regardless of what he's actually going to deliver. Now, Obama, at a critical point, the right kinds of pressures were applied to him from American voters on the one hand, from the British Parliament on the other, and even from Vladimir Putin, all saying that at a point when Obama and his advisors were inclined to get America deeply into the Syrian conflict, all of these other outside influences said, don't do it. American voters, were lighting up the lines in Congress saying, we oppose this war. The British Parliament was not going to give Obama the same kind of blank check the British Parliament had given George W. Bush during the Iraq War. The British were still, feeling the sting of, what they experienced with Tony Blair's leadership, taking them into the Iraq War, which was even more ridiculous for them to be in than it was for America. And then, Vladimir Putin said, I will get involved here to make sure that Syria doesn't have chemical weapons. He writes an op-ed for the New York Times. Now, just think about it. Of course, today, how many of these forces have been neutralized or taken off the table? So those pressures, don't even exist now if Obama were back in office. And Obama himself, I think, was, for all that I would criticize him, was personally a little bit less, vindictive and hawkish than, either the Clintons or than Joe Biden. But those conditions, which made Obama a little bit better than the average run of Democrats from Clinton through to Biden, those have gone away. And I expect Harris to be very much in line with Bill Clinton, with Hillary Clinton, and with Joe Biden. And even the mild improvements that you saw in some aspects with Obama are probably going to go away. And of course, under Obama, that's when we had this kind of new development of permanent drone warfare all around the world. And that was so low cost in terms of American body bags coming back to Dover that you could see that Barack Obama saw no reason to back off from that kind of policy. I suspect you'll see a lot of that with Harris as well. And Harris probably also wants to prove that, if a woman becomes president, particularly a Democratic woman, that she can be tough, that she can be firm. And that means she's going to be, probably inclined to give in to any advisor who says you should, show a tough hand to the world and, engage in a lot of bombing and drone attacks and so forth.
Which is ironic because in the meantime, we're hearing all sorts of calls for a feminist foreign policy from the left who insist that if we have a woman president or women leaders, we will have less war and more peace. And as you point out, it's not likely to be the case because they're going to have something to prove. And she has not disabused us of that assumption with how she's been talking about foreign policy so far. We got about a minute. I want to ask about Trump and your confidence level, both of you, and that he will put the right people into place, because as we know, Trump does not have a strong foreign policy doctrine. We don't know half the time what he's thinking about Ukraine or Israel. Ukraine, maybe a little bit more. He says he's going to end that war in 24 hours. With Israel, he just says Israel just must finish it, without explaining really what he will do when he comes into office. So yes, it'll be up to who he puts into place. Do we have any idea of who that might be, and whether it'll be in a more realist and restraint camp as opposed to OG Republican hawkery?
I personally have less than zero confidence that he'll appoint the right people. I think he's going to make the same mistake that he made the first time around. There's every indication that he's going to do so. And I think if you look at some of the names of the people associated with the America First Policy Institute, the name of that organization is misleading at best.
Yeah.
You have a lot of traditional Republican hawks that he surrounded himself with. So as much as I would like to see a national security advisor McGregor, I don't think that's going to happen.
Dan?
Yeah, I think there's a better than zero chance. So I'll be more optimistic than James on that front. But at the same time, the record of the first Trump administration certainly gives one pause. People like Mike Pompeo still seem to have a lot of credit within the larger Trump universe. The thing I would say about Trump is that you do have a faction, at least, which is for realism and restraint. And there were people, especially towards the end of the first Trump administration, finally there was a ability to overcome some of the barriers that had existed within the Republican administration that had kept good people out of some of the positions they needed to be in. So there's a little bit of hope that perhaps, a new Trump administration would be more open to putting the right people in positions. I think the selection of J.D. Vance was actually encouraging in that respect, because Vance has been quite outspoken on foreign policy, especially on the Ukraine issue. And, obviously that was not only a very high profile, policy or personnel selection right there, but also the vice president's office had traditionally been a position of influence that neoconservatives had used in Republican administrations, not only to advance their own policies, but also to veto and to sabotage anyone who might be less interventionist, who might get a job in a Republican administration. So Mike Pence's office was actually very nasty and very effective at keeping some good people out of the Trump administration. Obviously, before Pence, you had Dick Cheney, who was, again, Bush himself, George W. Bush, was quite bad enough. Dick Cheney was even worse. The vice president's office was a source of much trouble. And then before that, of course, you have, Dan Quayle, who might seem relatively harmless, but who was Dan Quayle's chief of staff? It was William Kristol, the princeling of the neocons. And then before that, you had Reagan. Reagan, okay, better than the neocons, but who was his VP? His VP was George H.W. Bush. So the vice president's selection and the vice president's office has traditionally been something that has made Republican foreign policy worse. And with the selection of J.D. Vance, there's actually a chance this time that it might make Republican foreign policy better.
Those are some great points, Dan. I want to talk to you more about that offline, but we've run out of time, and I'm so appreciative that both of you could be on the show and engage in this conversation, and I hope that you'll come back.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Kelly.